While we're waiting, just introduce myself. My name's James Cadman. I work for Action Sustainability in the Supply Chain School, and I'm going to be your host for the next 45 to 50 minutes or so to discuss carbon reporting. So like I say, we'll just allow everyone to join. Cool. So I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Sophie, who's going to take you through some brief notices, some virtual housekeeping. So over to you, Sophie.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks for joining, as James just said. So just a couple of technical notices. So if you're having any technical difficulties, if you can't hear properly, we recommend that you try Google Chrome first, but feel free to write any questions you have in the chat box in the right hand corner. I can help you out with those hopefully, or you can alternatively dial in with a phone, the numbers up there and the pin as well. You're welcome to write any questions throughout, and then we will speak to James and pose some of the questions to him at the end. So you can do this as well in the chat box in the corner. We're re-recording this webinar as well, and we'll send the link round after, and it'll be uploaded to our website. So if you want to watch that back or send to any colleagues, you can do so. And we'll also be running some polls on Kahoot today. So if you could please download the app if you haven't already. You can do it on the App Store on your smartphone. If you don't have a smartphone, then you can join in a browser. And I'll explain how to do that later on when we get to that point. But please join in, and we hope to make it as interactive as possible. So yeah, encourage everyone to join in on those. So I'll hand back over to James now to start us off.
Cool.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sophie. And just one final thing, that there's quite a lot of information in these slides, so do feel free to take notes, but we will obviously provide the recording of the webinar, but likewise the slides themselves, should anyone wish to refer to them afterwards, because a couple of the slides are fairly information heavy, I warn you now. Okay, so what are we going to cover in this workshop? There's 4 key topics we want to look at. Why are we reporting carbon? What's the point of it all? What is the global and the UK response to that need, that driver? How should we report our carbon? And that gets into a lot of the detail I was just mentioning. And where do we get our data from to enable us to do that reporting? So why are we reporting carbon? What are the issues that are driving us to do this? Some of you might have seen these slides before when I've done carbon footprinting training. For those who haven't, this is a graph that gives us a picture of how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere going back almost 1 million years. This is important because it gives us the history, the heritage of how concentrated the Earth's atmosphere has been for CO2, which is the main climate change causing gas. And you can see that going back over time, that the concentration has been somewhere between 150, maybe 180, and at the most 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. And just very simply, parts per million means for every million atoms or molecules in the air, 300 of them are carbon dioxide. And you can see it's kind of gone up and down fairly steadily over the last million or so years. And where there's been less carbon dioxide has coincided with an ice age, and where there's more CO2, it's generally a warmer period. But importantly, on the right hand end, you can see that it's spiked up. It's done a hockey stick shape, as it's known in the trade, basically due to the Industrial Revolution and us using fossil fuels for all kinds of needs and industry. Just to put some perspective on that, that red line shows where we as a species emerged. So there's a long history of relative stability of the Earth's atmosphere, and we are affecting that quite drastically with what we're doing through our use of fossil fuels. This graph puts a bit more detail on the last couple of 100 years, 150 years or so, and this talks about the change in temperature that's associated with the rise in carbon dioxide. Essentially, since the Industrial Revolution, the Earth's atmosphere, on average, globally, has gone up about 1 degree. Recent measurements were it's 0.85, 0.9 degrees Celsius that it's gone up, and this is in line with the increase in carbon dioxide as well. All these measurements have been taken through ice core samples and from various observatories around the world, and they all correlate strongly. So there's lots of evidence, there's overwhelming evidence that we are having an effect on the Earth's atmosphere. What are the impacts of that? What have we seen? Well, I'm sure you'll recognise many of these pictures as some of the outcomes of increasing global CO2 and temperature rises. Wildfires in Australia, north of the Arctic Circle, more frequent and more extreme storms and hurricanes in the Caribbean, off the coast of Mozambique, heat waves in Europe, excessive flooding, more frequent and more extreme than we're used to in Europe. And then if you look to the South Pacific, coral reef bleaching due to slightly warmer temperatures in the water and a greater level of acidity. So the impacts are global. Some areas are affected more than others, but this is a global issue. So what causes climate change? I've given you one of those for free, carbon dioxide. Anything that you burn, whether it's coal, oil, gas, will produce CO2. So it can come from our power grid, it can come from the vehicles that we use, and it can come from a lot of other sources as well. But there are other gases that cause climate change, and there's 6 of them that are really very important and the most prominent. The next one is methane. A lot of that comes from agricultural sources, anaerobic digestion from composting. So the farming sector is doing a lot around their ability to reduce methane emissions. The next one is called nitrous oxide. You might know it as laughing gas or Entonox. It has been used for those 2 reasons, as an anesthetic, but also as a propellant, a gas propellant, because it's inert, it's safe to use around human food, and it doesn't burn, importantly. The next one is sulfur hexafluoride, quite a niche one, but anyone who works with high voltage equipment and switchgear will have heard of sulfur hexafluoride. It's a very important gas because it provides an insulation around that high voltage and prevents fires. And it's not toxic, it's not flammable, and it's not poisonous to us. Then there's a pair of other compounds called hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. Those are families of compounds that are often used in HVAC, in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. They're good at cooling things down effectively, making air cooler inside fridges, inside buildings. But they have large impacts on the climate. So these collectively are known as the Kyoto Protocol basket of 6 greenhouse gases. Why am I mentioning these now? Well, it's important when you come to do your carbon reporting that you're aware of these key 6 gases. There are many others, and there might be some niche ones that you use in your production facilities, or some of your suppliers do, but these are the main 6 that you need to be aware of and consider when you're thinking about your carbon reporting. And those have been used since the days of the Kyoto Protocol to understand how we can limit the global warming potential to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we're going to go to our first Kahoot question. So I'm going to hand over to Sophie to set that up. So get your phones at the ready or your other browser tab open.
Thanks, James. So you will need to still be able to see this browser on the screen that you're looking at the moment to see the questions. So if you could, if you have a phone, if you could enter that URL into that, that's probably the best way to do it. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat box. So I'm just going to switch over to Kahoot now. Hopefully you can see a nice green screen.
Yep.
So there will be a pin, so it's 458297. If you could enter that where you're being prompted to, I can see some coming up now, so that's great. So if you're on the app, there is a button encouraging you to start a new game.
That's great. Yeah, there's a button at the bottom of the screen that says enter pin, and it's got 4 colors: red, blue, green, and yellow. That's the button to enter the pin and your nickname.
Thanks, James. Okay, I'll just give it a few more seconds to see if anyone else will join. Great. Let's get started. The pin is at the bottom of the screen throughout the slide. So if you ever get drop off or want to join back in, just re-enter that same pin again. And likewise, if you're still setting up, then you can join it later on. Okay, let's get going.
Cool.
So the first question is to put the 4 greenhouse gases in order of impact on the planet's climate from lowest to highest.
So if you put the lowest one that has the least impact. So you should be able to
drag those into the right order on your screen now.
With the lowest on the left.
See some answers coming in now, so that's great. So that's showing the correct order now on the screen. James, do you want to talk through those?
Super. Yep. So the correct order is carbon dioxide has the lowest impact per kilo of carbon dioxide per ton of gas, then methane, then nitrous oxide, then sulfur hexafluoride. So if you work in the high voltage sector for National Grid, for example, sulfur hexafluoride is a very very important substance to be aware of when it comes to global warming potential. Okay, thank you. So if you want to flip back to the next thing. Oh, there you go. Sorry, we've got the scores. IP's on top, followed by Ben, then Lisa, and then another Ben, and then Amanda. So okay, we'll see how we go. We've got 3 of these questions through the workshop, so we'll see how people perform. Great. Thank you. So back to the main part. So yes, that was the question. And this is the reasoning why. There's something called global warming potential. And again, this is important for you to know for your carbon reporting, that not all gases are the same. It's very important to realize that most of the time you'll be dealing with carbon dioxide, but if, like I said before, you have some processes that emit methane or even nitrous oxide, you need to understand that they have a very different impact on the world's climate, on the climate change impact. So this is the technical jargon for this is global warming potential, and what it means is that for every ton of carbon dioxide you get a level of 1 impact. There's no units, it's just 1, but a ton of methane has 25 times the level of impact. So that's why it's very important to understand exactly what you're emitting and the amount of that as well. Nitrous oxide is almost 300 times the impact of carbon dioxide, whereas sulfur hexafluoride that we looked at is almost 23,000 times the impact kilo for kilo compared to carbon dioxide. So while CO2 is the most prevalent, the others are very important to understand as well. And the way we convert between these is so that we're not comparing apples with pears, is that we talk about tons of CO2 equivalent. So if you had an emissions inventory database and you gathered all your emissions of various greenhouse gases and you said, right, we've got a ton of methane in that, you'd have to do a conversion and say, well, that's equivalent to 25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It's like changing your money between dollars and pounds or euros. It's a conversion rate. So you can compare your emissions with a previous year or with a competitor or with some industrial benchmark. So that's an important piece of jargon to understand. So moving on more widely, what's the response been globally and the UK's response? I'm sure many of you will remember that we had a rather historic agreement coming out of the Paris COP meeting a few years back. The first time we got agreement globally. Generally, globally, the US are still doing something slightly differently, but generally agreement globally that we need to do something about this, and we'll put measures in place to do something about it. And we'll put in national action plans to follow and make sure that we're taking the right trajectory towards reducing our carbon as far as possible. So it's at least 2 degrees C is the maximum amount of warming that we're allowing above pre-industrial levels. Since then, about a year and a half ago, the IPCC came out with a document that said 2 degrees is great, but we need to go further. We need to go to 1.5 degrees, no more than 1.5 degrees warming. And they came out with a very technical report, and they talked about lots of information in terms of what the benefit would be about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. And that is now taken as the trajectory that we need to follow to reach the acceptable levels of climate change. And this all ties in with the net zero that's been discussed in the UK. Bringing it to the UK, the graph on the left talks about our total emissions over various years. So in 1990, we as a country emitted about 800 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Over time, by 2017, that number had gone down almost by half, so kind of 500 million tonnes of carbon dioxide have been emitted. And a lot of that is due to the decarbonisation of our grid electricity. We've moved away from coal extensively. We now have more gas. We have increasing amount of renewables. We still have some nuclear power. So we are decarbonising the grid. So anytime you plug anything in, a lot of the work has been done for you in terms of reducing your carbon emissions. But there's still further that we need to go. We're now talking about net zero by 2050. The UK had something called the Climate Change Act from 2008. We were the first country to have a legally binding piece of legislation and targets around reducing carbon emissions. The law did say that we have to reduce them by 80%. We are now going to reduce them by 100% totally, allowing for some offsetting to get to net zero rather than absolute zero. So we're looking to get to net zero by 2050. And the graph on the right talks about how we're going to get there. What are the steps we need to take as a country? What things do we need to do at a technological level, through our grid electricity, through our transport, our buildings, and so on? But there's still a challenge. We are making good progress, but there's still a challenge. And as I say, Theresa May's parting shot before she left office this time last year was to amend the Climate Change Act that we will reduce emissions totally by 100% to net zero by 2050. Slight variation in Scotland and Wales because slight different situations, but essentially it's the same thing. Interestingly, with the current COVID situation, measurements have been done to show that our emissions, carbon emissions, have gone down by about 5% in the UK since lockdown, which is significant, and it shows it can be done. It gives us some comfort that we can reduce our emissions, but the reality is to reach net zero, we need to reduce our emissions by 7.5% year on year, every year to reach 2050. So we've made good progress, but we need to continue that and increase it to reach the 7.5% that we need every year. Bringing it to our sector, there's something that's been around for several years now called Construction 2025. This is a document that sets out what the industry needs to do around reducing waste, reducing carbon, being leaner and more efficient. So it's a document that has set the pace essentially for our sector about reducing climate change emissions. And in there it talks about a 50% reduction by 2025. So how should we report our carbon? What are the mechanisms for actually reporting that? I'm going to take you through some of the key pieces of legislation and voluntary reporting mechanisms. This is not an exhaustive introduction, an exhaustive section on reporting mechanisms. I think we'd need a lot more time and probably a very strong cup of coffee as well, because there are several mechanisms and they are legislation at the heart of it. So some of these you might recognise already, and some of you might even report to them. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what they're about, who's involved, who's not, and why, and how you report to them. But before we do that, we're going to go into our second Kahoot question. And this is to test your understanding of some of the jargon, because along with global warming potential, understanding this piece of jargon is pretty much essential for you to report. So what we're going to ask you is, what do scope 2 carbon emissions refer to? What does that mean? I'm going to hand back over to Sophie to run the Kahoot.
Thank you. So for those of you who have just joined us, you can still join Kahoot by looking at the link, which I'm just going to share now. So in the bottom left corner there, you can see the address to type in, the URL, and the game pin as well, if you'd like to join, if you haven't already. So I'm just going to start the next question now. This isn't a drag and drop one like the last one. This is just select the correct answer. So let's go.
Great, so that's finished. Yes, the correct answer was blue, the symbol of electricity. So about a third of you have got that right, maybe, yeah, just under half got that right. So well done. I will give you more of an explanation of that. If we flip into the slides. Oh, sorry, yes, I always forget this. Oh, we've got some new names coming into the top 5. We've still got Ben and Ben. Very close there, vying for second and third. Super, okay. So yes, here's some jargon that is, as I say, essential, probably mandatory jargon for reporting carbon. This picture is taken from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is one of the most widely accepted standards and methods for calculating and reporting on your carbon. This picture says 1,000 words. It's probably the most useful picture to take away from this session. Understanding what scopes mean is really important because you'll need it for regulatory reporting and for reporting to your clients, for submitting into bids and other documents, you name it. Scope 1, 2, and 3 is shorthand for so much, and getting a grip of what that means will make your lives a lot easier when it comes to reporting. So, Scope 1 emissions are essentially anything that you burn directly that you have control over. So that might be gas in a boiler in your basement. It might be fuel in vehicles that you own and you operate and control. It might be fugitive emissions. So if you have a leak from your HVAC system, you are releasing that greenhouse gas. You have control over that, so that's your emission. And you might have process emissions. So if you have a chemical or physical process that through the manufacturing process, it emits some kind of CO2 or other greenhouse gas, then that's your scope 1. So a common example of that is the manufacture of cement, where you're doing the calcination process of limestone. That gives off CO2, as well as the energy that's used in heating up the limestone as well. So that's your scope 1. Scope 2 is essentially any electricity you buy in. So when you pay your bill to npower, E.ON, SSE, any of the power providers, and they are essentially creating energy on your behalf. They are burning something on your behalf, sending it down a pylon. You're plugging in your devices, your equipment, and you're consuming that energy. That's your scope 2 indirect energy. It also applies to heat and steam and a few other niche activities. Scope 3 is essentially everything else. So upstream scope 3 activities, so your business travel, where you go by train or plane, where you buy in products and materials that somebody else has manufactured and you're buying it off them. You're buying a service such as a provision of water from, in my region, Thames Water, or a waste contractor who's taking away waste and processing it on your behalf. And likewise, there's downstream activities as well. So if you manufacture products that are then going to be used by somebody else and energy is going to be consumed, that's part of your scope 3 downstream emissions. So understanding how those fit together is really important because many documents, many pieces of legislation refer to those terms of those jargon. Okay, so the first one, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, SECR, or SECR, as some people call it. And this kind of incorporates mandatory company reporting as well, to a greater or lesser extent. Okay, so this is where the slides get a little bit dense. Apologies, there's a lot of information to transmit, but like I said at the beginning, the slides will be made available and the recording as well if you want to go back and refer to them. I'm also providing URLs to the kind of the source material if you want even greater detail. SECR came in 1st of April last year. And it replaces the CRC, the carbon reduction commitment. So many of you will have probably had to report under the CRC, and that was a tortuous, painful piece of legislation, and rightly it's been replaced. Hopefully the SECR will be more straightforward for people to report to. Who's in, who's out? How do you qualify? So all quoted companies, if you are on the London Stock Exchange, the European equivalent, the New York Stock Exchange, or if you're quoted on the NASDAQ, you have to report under SECR. And that builds on the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting that is part of an annual director's report. What's different here, and this is where it replaces the CRC, that large unquoted companies also have to report, as do limited liability partnerships. And the thresholds that tell you where you qualify or not to report are if you have a turnover of £36 million or more, and or you have a balance sheet of greater than £18 million, and or you employ more than 250 people. So essentially, if you're greater than an SME, if you're bigger than an SME, and you have to have two out of three of those qualifications to be included. So that is similar in some respects to the Modern Slavery Act, the financial threshold there. That's where the similarity comes in. The scopes and the process. So what you're required to do is calculate your scope 1 and 2 emissions from your activities. Global if you're a quoted company, UK if you're a large unquoted company, for which you're responsible. So this is why it's important to know what scope 1 and 2 are. So anything where you have direct control of the fuels that you use, the electricity you consume, it's important to be able to gather the data and report on them. There's also an aspect of scope 3 business travel for large unquoted companies if you're responsible for purchasing the fuel. So for example, if you've got staff who go out and do business trips in their own car and they claim the fuel back through a purchase card or through some expenses system, that's included as well. You also have to include the underlying energy use. It's not just about the tons of CO2 emitted, it's about the gigawatt hours, megawatt hours of energy that is equivalent to as well. Because there's an efficiency thing here. Of course, you could use a given amount of energy, but where that energy source comes from will heavily determine how much CO2 is kicked out. If that energy comes from coal, you'll get a lot of CO2. If it comes from a solar panel or a wind turbine, you'll get next to nothing. You'll get zero CO2. So having the energy and the carbon is important. There are some additional requirements. It's not just about the numbers. You also need to produce at least one intensity ratio. So you have the absolute numbers, the kilowatt hours and the CO2, tons of CO2, but also a ratio. Normally it's emissions per pound of turnover, 100,000 pounds of turnover, or it could be something like gross internal floor area, GIFA. So there's some way of understanding how efficient you are with your energy compared to your manufacturing, your production processes. For the comparison, you need to provide last year's energy, GHG emissions, and the intensity figures, so you can compare. Are you getting better or worse? You need to state which calculation methodology you're using. I've mentioned the GHG protocol. There are many others out there. The second most common one is an ISO standard, 14064. That takes you through the process of understanding what you need to measure, how you need to set your boundaries, who you need to speak to, how you report, and so on. Very, very useful documents. And then importantly, you need to provide some information, some narrative on the energy efficiency actions that you've taken to reduce your energy consumption and reduce your CO2 emissions. So there's some examples on the screen there. You might have installed smart meters to give you more accurate data. You might have upgraded your equipment to that's more efficient, that's newer. Conversely, you might have installed some on-site renewables, solar panels on a roof, for example. And then the human element, training people on how to be more energy efficient. Reporting. It's annually, starting through your financial year, starting on or after the 1st of April 2019, and you file the report with Companies House in your director's report. The CRC used to go to the Environment Agency. This is slightly different. It's done through your director's report. Now, like with any scheme, there's always loopholes or exceptions or things that are slightly different. This is a very brief summary of those. If you are potentially in one of these brackets, then you need to look at the information to get a more detailed view. But to give you a summary of that, essentially, if you use less than 40 megawatt hours per year of energy, you don't need to do the detailed reporting. You just need to make a statement that says, we've looked at our energy use. We reckon we can demonstrate we use less than 40 megawatt hours of energy per year. We don't need to report. And you leave it at that. Just to give you some kind of indication of what 40 megawatt hours per year is, it's equivalent to about 3 households consumption, three average UK households consuming energy for a year. So it's not actually that much in terms of your energy use, but that's one way of not having to report. If you're a subsidiary of a larger company, and if in your own right you wouldn't have to report because of the thresholds, the £36 million, the 250 employees, if you're a subsidiary in your own right, you can say we don't need to report because in our own right we wouldn't have to. Saying that, if you've got a company, a parent company who's reporting and they're including you within that, you might not have to report either because they might be doing that reporting on your behalf. And then all the other scope 3 areas are voluntary. So outside of the business travel one I mentioned for large and quoted companies, all other scope 3, such as the materials you buy through your procurement, is voluntary. And finally, there's a rather long URL where you can access the guidance from the .gov.uk webpage. Okay, on to ESOS, Energy Savings and Opportunity Scheme. Word of warning, there's similarities, but there are some differences. They are not alike. There are some bits where you think they're the same, but they're actually quite different. So ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, was brought into law in the middle of July 2014 from an EU directive. As far as we know, that's going to still be in place, albeit we don't know where Brexit's going to go, but to all intents and purposes, it will probably stay in place in some shape or form. And it's there to encourage organisations to actively audit their energy consumption and look for opportunities to reduce energy. It does what it says on the tin. The qualification here is similar, but different, and annoyingly so. So you qualify if you are a large undertaking in the language of the regulation. So again, if you are not an SME, if you've got 250 employees or more, the financial thresholds are different. It's not £36 million, it's about £45 million. And this is where the European Union sets their thresholds. It's always €50 million in your turnover and €43 million in your balance sheet. So the numbers are different. And you have to comply with those. You have to meet those if you are going to qualify. Again, this is where it differs to the SECR. If you are part of a larger organisation that meets the above criteria, the highest UK parent is responsible for reporting, and you will be included in that as a subsidiary, whether you like it or not. You have to do that, which is where it was similar to the CRC. For those of you who remember the CRC, if you were a tiny little subsidiary, you'd be hoovered up amongst everyone else to report under CRC. Streamlined energy carbon reporting is different. As I said, you can claim that if you wouldn't have to report yourself, you don't have to. ESOS, you do. And likewise, if you're an overseas company with a UK registered establishment, so a business unit, an OPCO in the UK, which has 250 or more employees, you have to comply. Okay. Scopes and process. So again, this is similar. You have to calculate the energy use from your assets and activities for which you're responsible, the buildings and the industrial processes and the transport that you consume, scopes 1 and 2. You have to identify significant areas of consumption, looking at least across 90% of all of your consumption. So you don't have to look for every single nut and bolt. It's the 80-20 rule, or the 90-10 rule in this case. Importantly, you have to appoint a lead assessor to carry out your energy audits and the ESOS assessment. This is effectively a site audit of your energy consumption to look for opportunities to reduce energy and then report on it. So the criteria are that you need 12 months of continuous energy consumption data. You analyse that consumption for areas of efficiency and where there are opportunities to reduce energy consumption that are practicable and cost effective. So it's inherently asking you to do a whole life cost benefit analysis, working out the cost of energy saved per unit saved. You also have to undertake a sample of site audits. It can't just be a desktop process. Interestingly and bizarrely, there's no regulatory requirement to implement the opportunities that have been identified. You have to undertake the audit, provide the evidence, identify your energy consumption, and importantly, where those opportunities to reduce energy are and what the benefits of that are. But there's no obligation to actually do anything with that. That's the way the regulation is. It's highly advised that people do act on the information that they get, and as I've just said a few minutes ago, the idea is that those opportunities are practicable and cost effective. So you'd think you've got over the return on investment argument, but yes, there is no requirement to actually do that. In terms of reporting, you have to submit a report online as a notification of compliance to the Environment Agency. You need to keep records. That's an important part of this for several years. And the environmental regulator can impose civil sanctions and fines for non-compliance. So there is a financial incentive to do this. Reporting is every 4 years. It's not annually like other schemes. We're currently in our 3rd compliance period. That started early December last year, goes to the 5th of December 2023. And during that period, you have to undertake these audits and make your report. You report to the regulator relevant to your country within the UK. So Environment Agency in England, SECR in Scotland, NRW in Wales, and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency. There are fines, as I say, for failing to do various stages, various parts of ESOS. If you don't notify the regulator, if you don't maintain your records, if you fail to undertake an audit, do the site sampling, or if you make a deliberately misleading statement. And some of these fines can be quite substantial financially. They can be up to £50,000 in terms of making a misleading statement if that is proven to be the case. So it's worth making sure you actually do it. And I was reading somewhere recently that the fines for ESOS Phase 2, which finished at just before Christmas last year, those fines are already being sent out to those organisations that have failed to do what they should have done. There are some exceptions. Again, if your organisation is fully compliant and certified to ISO 50001, the energy management standard, then you comply. And you just need to state that you have that standard and you comply. If you're partially compliant with that standard, you need to identify which bits are compliant and which parts of your organisation aren't, and therefore you need to go and do the ESOS requirements for those parts of your business that don't come under the scope of your ISO 50001. And if you have display energy certificates, those are useful information to bypass some of the data gathering processes. And finally, the URL there as well, which will be in the slides. Okay, so those are the two main pieces of legislative reporting that you need to think about. There are others. I'm sure many of you have heard of the European Union's emission trading scheme. I'm not going to touch on that today because it really is there for really large intensive energy users such as steelworks, glass makers and so on. If there's an interest in that, we'll happily put that on, but our feeling is that it's outside the realm for most people when it comes to energy and carbon reporting. I'm now going to move on to voluntary reporting, the first of which is the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's now been rebranded as CDP. Most people still know it as the Carbon Disclosure Project. And then I'll move on to a couple of others. So the CDP, their purpose, they've got a mission statement almost. This is more than just reporting and legislation. They've got a mission to gather climate change data from large corporations to understand what is being done to reduce carbon emissions and energy use. And the call is coming mainly from large institutional investors, the big investment houses across the world, but also the larger procuring organisation, the big companies around the world that want to know what's happening in their supply chain. They want to understand the position for carbon and what actions are being taken to reduce it. And then obviously identify risks, seek opportunities where carbon can be further reduced. They have a measurement process. It covers a lot of the same stuff as the legislation that I've just talked about. Scopes 1, 2, and 3. You have to indicate which scopes you're covering and what you're including in this voluntary submission. But it's covering the same kinds of energy consumption, albeit just packaged up in a slightly different fashion. The reporting is a lot more substantial in many respects. The questionnaire that comes out with the CDP is anywhere up to 180 pages long. It is seriously detailed, and it's not just about the energy you consume and the emissions that your organisation puts into the atmosphere, but there's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot around the processes, the governance that goes into how you measure and manage your carbon emissions and your energy consumption. What's your business strategy? What's your long-term view for reducing carbon? What targets and performance measures do you have in place? And what actions have you taken to date to reduce your energy? So it's more of a story than just numbers, and it requires a lot of input. Having supported organisations in the past with doing this, it is a very labour-intensive process to do. So yeah, be warned. You have to state which method or standard that you're using. It's up to you. There's no obligation to use the GHG protocol or any of the others. In fact, the guidance from CDP gives a whole long list of methods and standards that you can choose from. So it's up to you. You have to disclose annually if you've been requested to, and you're happy to do so by your client or your investor. And there's a sectoral approach specifically for construction, but there are other sectors as well where some of the questions are refined and bespoke to the sector in question. For those of you who report to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other routes, there are tacit links between that. So there is some commonality and read across to make things a little less onerous and joined up. But yes, it's a full-on process. And there's a link there. CDP also do reporting against water consumption as well, but that's obviously a separate piece. Okay. Science-based targets is the next one. Again, a voluntary mechanism. This is actually a partnership between CDP themselves, but with some other organisations, including the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. The intention here is to provide a route and a mechanism for organisations to understand what they need to do to reduce their carbon emissions so that we can come in line with what the Paris Climate Change Agreement says about reducing our emissions to at least 2 degrees, if not 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What's the trajectory we need to take? What's the slope we need to go down at an organisational level to ensure that we can do that? And along the way, identify opportunities where we can reduce carbon and reduce cost. So many organisations are now looking to do this. It's a voluntary scheme. No one's telling you to do it, but more and more organisations, many of the partners in the school are actually signing up to SBTs, getting their method approved and publicly stating that they are working in accordance with SBTs. And the likelihood is that they'll be coming to their suppliers and their contractors to help them with that. And this will give you some of the reasons why. Because when you say that you're going to do SBTs because you've got a commitment to reduce carbon and be net zero by 2050, or at least keep your emissions down so that you're in alignment with the Paris Climate Change Agreement, you need to do several things. You need to select a suitable trajectory pathway, and there's various details within the SBT on how you do that. Whether you do an absolute approach or whether you take a sectoral approach that's defined for a particular industrial sector, and set yourself targets. How much are you going to reduce by when? Target setting. It will cover your scope 1, 2 emissions, but if your scope 3, if your supply chain emissions account for at least 40%, if not more, of your overall emissions, then you need to include your supply chain as well, which is why many of the partners in the supply chain school will be coming out to suppliers and contractors and saying, can you help us with this? Can you provide us your carbon emissions? Because it will form part of their scope 3 emissions. Then once you've done that, it's developing a plan. How are you going to hit your reduction targets within the 10-year time frame, between 5 and 15 years from now? What actions are you going to take? How are you going to demonstrate that you've reduced your emissions? And of course, over time, it's going to get harder and harder. The grid is being decarbonised, as I said, on our behalf, so to speak. But we need to be clever about what we can do in terms of the way we travel, the kinds of vehicles we use, the kinds of energy we use to power our machinery and our equipment, the kind of materials that we buy in, what's the embodied carbon within those materials, how were they manufactured by our suppliers? And then, like any reporting system, you need to capture your data and analyse it and report it on an annual basis and demonstrate those actions that you've undertaken. And there's the web link. Okay. Finally, 5th one, the school's climate action group. Having seen who's logged onto the call, I can see many of you are involved in the school's climate action group already, but for those of you who are not aware of it, the supply chain school has had a climate action group running for about 9 months now. It's going to be a very similar purpose. We're looking to drive down carbon emissions from the built environment, but rather than just making a statement to say we want to be net zero by a certain date, we want to take action on this. And there's 2 things that we're doing primarily. We are looking to measure the magnitude of our carbon emissions using an online performance tool to capture data, understand where hotspots are, and then support members on how they can actually reduce their carbon through data, but also through the learning materials that the school is known and loved for. So the process and the scope for this is that we ask you to identify your carbon emissions within the UK. So it's a UK-based thing. We're not looking at global operations, not yet at least, covering your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So again, any emissions that you are directly in control of and the electricity that you procure to run your facilities and your assets. We're asking people to include their scope 3 emissions if they are the manufacturing point of a carbon intensive material. Clearly a lot of materials get consumed in the construction sector, in the built environment. So we want to make sure that we don't leave that out, miss them out inadvertently. So there's some examples on the screen. There are many others that we've included as well. So where someone is the final point of manufacture, we're going to ask them to provide information on how much of that material is consumed. We then capture and analyze the data within the tool, and it's a very simple tool. You don't need to do the conversions yourselves. You simply provide data from your electricity bills, for example, in terms of your kilowatt hours or your tons of material consumed. The tool does all the maths for you. And then finally, you can access the school for support and guidance on how you can further reduce your emissions. We're asking organisations who've signed up to report quarterly. This seems a fair balance between monthly and annual reporting, and it gives us more of a semi-real-time indication that we're getting an understanding of how organisations are performing over time. There's a link in the Supply Chain School website to find out more information, and you can just get in touch with me directly if you're interested in joining that. As it's through the school, it's all free at the point of consumption. So as I say, do get in touch if you're interested. So there was a roller coaster ride through some of the main pieces of carbon reporting legislation and voluntary mechanisms. I'll be interested to know which of you already report to some of those mechanisms or not, or if you don't know, that's great, that's fine. So I'm going to hand back over to Sophie, who's going to take us through our third and final Kahoot question.
Thanks, James. So just sharing my screen again. So this final question, you can select multiple answers. So select as many that are as relevant to your organisation as you like. Here we go. Thanks very much, everyone. So hopefully you can see the answers on your screen now. I'll hand back over to James.
Thanks, Sophie. So, yep, many of you report to SECR and ESOS and voluntary schemes as well. Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. And some of you don't know. Hopefully, with the information from today, those who don't know can go and find out if their organisation is reporting. The threshold information is clearly one way of understanding whether you should be reporting. Whether you actually are or not is another matter. But yeah, okay, useful. Thank you. Great. So, final piece of the jigsaw. I've taken you on a quick canter through some of the key pieces of legislation and reporting mechanisms. We know why we're doing it, clearly. We've watched David Attenborough and Greta Thunberg and other people. But where do we get our data from? It's all very well saying you need to tell me how much energy I use, how much material I use, so on and so on. But it might not be too obvious where some of that data might come from. So this is a very quick run through where we might get our information. Just going back to that diagram I showed you from the greenhouse gas protocol of the main gases, this is an adapted version that's a bit easier to consume in some respects. So if we consider ourselves the contractor, all of us, we're a contractor in the middle of those three arrows, and that's the kind of information that we are looking at. So most of the time, you'll be looking at setting a boundary, and it's important to understand what you're including and what you're not including, which is a boundary, in terms of gathering your data. That will be dictated by your requirement to report to legislation or voluntary reporting mechanisms, but understanding and making it clear what is included and what is not included will help you in the process of gathering that data, speaking with colleagues, speaking with suppliers, to provide that information. So most organizations will look at what they know and they can control, your own scope 1 and 2. So as I've said already, you know, the kinds of energy that you might consume in your offices and facilities, whether it's gas, whether it's an oil of some sort or electricity, likewise in your own vehicles, plant and equipment, if you're using fuels in that, but also the chemical, biological processes, the methane from an AD plant and fugitive emissions. So you might say that's our boundary, that's what we're going to report against, or that's the information we're going to go and gather. You might then say, well, we know that we've got to do some business travel as well. Some of our clients or some of our reporting mechanisms are saying we need to include business travel. So that becomes part of your boundary as well. So, or your scope 3 business travel by rail or air or by car would come into that as well. And finally, you might say, oh, well, we know that we consume a lot of materials, and this is where the school's climate action group comes in. We need to consider all those carbon intensive materials that we buy because they contribute a huge amount to our overall footprint, and leaving them out would be avoiding the elephant in the room. So going through a process of saying, what are our boundaries? What are we including? What are we not including? And being really clear about that to whoever you're reporting to, so they understand what is in and what is out. So where do we get our data from? Fairly obvious areas where we need to get information from, but it's understanding who holds that data. Is it your utility provider who holds information on the amount of gas you consume or electricity, or is it on your SAP system, your own in-house data system of all your billings and invoices and so on? Is it in that? who has control of that? Can you access it yourself, or do you need to find the people who have access to all the information, the billing information, effectively? Procurement teams will have a lot of information as well, commercial teams, in terms of how many or how much material is consumed, if that's relevant. You might have a travel agency who books all your business travel. They in most cases will hold information on the numbers of flights, train journeys, and so on that have been booked. So understanding who holds that information, who is the gatekeeper, is really important for you to gather the right information that's accurate, so you can do your reporting as accurately as possible. It's understanding there's different kinds of data as well. Clearly, there's real data. If you get a bill from your power provider and they say you've consumed so many megawatt hours of electricity, great, you've got a number. Stick it in the reporting mechanism. It isn't always as easy as that, of course. You might have to use proxy data. And the most common example of that is fuel consumed in vehicles. You might not be able to get to a point of saying we've consumed so many litres of diesel in our plant and equipment, but you might easily get some kind of procurement information to understand how much you've spent on that fuel. And once you've got spend data and you understand how much the fuel is per litre, you can easily calculate how many litres of fuel in that example that you've consumed. And finally, the third main option for data is sample data. It might be too onerous or just not possible to get data for everything you consume, so you might have to do some kind of sampling technique to understand pro rata how much you're consuming for one site, and then you can scale it up to several sites of a similar nature. Or you could gather data for one time period within a year and then scale it up to a whole year, taking into account seasonal variations. Different ways of making that job a bit easier, but always importantly stating those assumptions, stating what you did to get to that data point. Okay, yes, relevance, accuracy, and bias. Make sure the data is relevant to your situation. That might sound like stating the obvious, but I've seen many organizations in the past that have grabbed data that looks like it's good enough, but isn't relevant to their situation or the particular reporting driver that they're being asked to report on. So they're reporting on information that's not required or not necessary, not relevant. Make sure your data is reliable and unbiased. So do check, go in, buyer beware, go in with your eyes open and make sure that the data that you're being provided is accurate and reliable, that it's up to date for the current period that you're looking to report on, and that it's reliable. It's not being biased in some shape or form. Importantly as well, this comes back to the sampling piece I just mentioned a minute ago, understand how much time and effort you've got to devote to this, and therefore how much control and influence you have over gathering that data. What can you actually gather? And using the Pareto principle sometimes helps in terms of working out, well, which is the data that accounts for the biggest amount of consumption, and therefore that's where we need to focus our effort in terms of accuracy. Cool. I've mentioned the GHG protocol a couple of times. This is really worth getting a copy of. It's free to download, or it was the last time I looked anyway, and it gives you all the information you need to understand about how you go about reporting your carbon emissions. How do you set boundaries? How do you understand what you control? How do you calculate different levels of emissions? And it gives consistency. It's allowing you to compare apples with apples. There are others available, as I say, but this is the main one. And there is a construction specific variant of that as well. Okay, penultimate slide, near enough. Resources and guidance. And again, don't stress yourselves, don't write all this down. This will be provided later, but this is a small sample of some of the resources available for free out there to help you do this. The first two from DEFRA and Bath University provide conversion factors. They're the things that enable you to convert your litres of diesel into tons of CO2, your kilowatt hours of electricity into tons of CO2. It's just mathematical numbers that you need to use and grab and do that manipulation. But there's some free resources out there to help you do that, so you don't have to go and get it from scratch. Likewise, there's some free calculator tools to help you actually do those calculations rather than building your own spreadsheet. The Environment Agency have got one, Highways England, there's one specific to the rail sector from RSSB, and the Carbon Trust have got one as well, which is aimed primarily at SMEs. There are many others out there. There are others that you can pay for. I would advise you go and get a free one to begin with, have a play around with that, and when you're ready to take on something that's more complicated potentially, but also comes with a license fee, then move on to that. Okay, and finally, this whole webinar has been about compliance and about reporting, but gathering that data on carbon and energy is more than just compliance. There's lots of other good reasons why we should be gathering that information and doing something about it. Clearly, regulation is part of it, but if we can make financial savings through identifying opportunities for reduction, then all the better for us. We can improve our stakeholder reputation. We can win more work. There's lots of other benefits, business drivers and benefits for us to gather that data, to go through that effort and that reporting process. So that's me done for now. Thank you for listening. I hope that was informative. As I said, Sophie will be providing the slides or the link to the recording at the end of the session. So yeah, great. Thank you. Sophie, is there anything you want to add in?
Thanks very much, James. We have got a couple of questions just been asked, so we've got 5 minutes left, so just go through a few of those now, if that's okay. Yep. So a few on scopes. So this one asking, quite relevant to where we are at the moment, so is energy use when working from home included in scope 3? And also another question about if employees are provided a cash allowance to purchase their own vehicles and use them for business use, would that be scope 1 or scope 3?
So there's two pieces there. There's home use. Home use would come, in my view, under scope 3, because the company doesn't have direct control over how much energy you use, but clearly it's an impact. We're all at home. We're putting the kettle on a lot more frequently, or certainly I am. So that would come under scope 3. The business vehicle one, if you're given an allowance, it depends on who pays for the fuel, really. If you are driving a vehicle around for business use, and you're putting fuel in yourself and then claiming that back through an expenses system, or you're given a card, a company card, to pay for that, the company has control over that in effect, because you're working on behalf of the company. So that would be your scope 1.
Thanks, James. Just another one on construction 2025. They use 1990 as a baseline. What should we do if a company doesn't have data for 1990?
It's a good question. 1990 is used as the baseline for most mechanisms to understand how far we've moved. If you haven't got 1990, effectively use the oldest set of data that you have got good and accurate information for. So go back as far as you can, whilst maintaining a level of accuracy and robustness.
Thanks. I'll just do one final question, I think. So the Schools Climate Action Group, so an organisation, if they would like to set up a measurement system, they haven't done it before, can the group help with this?
Yeah, definitely. So a bit more on the Climate Action Group. We've got about, I want to say, 80 organisations involved. There's lots of partners and lots of suppliers and contractors to those partners involved. We as Action Sustainability, running the school, are supporting those individual organisations to get involved and get you signed up to using the tool. Like I say, it's free. There's no financial cost. We provide all the information to get you up and running on that, the kinds of information you need to gather, and then obviously access to the online tool itself to plug those numbers in. So we support you in terms of, well, you know, here are all the metrics that you should be reporting against, tell us which ones are relevant to you, give you a user account and so on, and then help support you with gathering that data, or give you an indication as to where you might get that data from, and then enable you to plug it into the tool to understand your own carbon footprint.
Great, thanks a lot, James. So I think we'll end it there, just coming up to an hour. If anyone has any further questions, I'll be sending out an email this afternoon with the slides and recording, as we mentioned, so feel free to ask any questions and we'll try and get back to you. And if you could please, once I finish the webinar now, complete the feedback form. So we're developing our online events throughout this period, so it's really helpful for us to get feedback from you on what you liked and what you didn't. So that'd be great. It only takes a couple of minutes. And thanks for joining.
Yep, great. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.